Hello and welcome back to the Atlas Agency's continuing investigation of the Path to Carcosa cycle for Arkham Horror the card game. I'm your host Brandon, and today I'll be sharing my spoiler-free first impressions of the new scenario in Echoes of the Past, the first Mythos Pack in the Carcosa cycle. Echoes of the Past is the third scenario in the Carcosa campaign, and it follows on the events of the two scenarios in the Path to Carcosa Deluxe box. It sees the investigators exploring the Arkham Historical Society in search of information to further their investigation of the King in Yellow. In its story and theme, it reminds me somewhat of the Miskatonic Museum, the first Mythos Pack in the previous cycle, though the gameplay in this scenario is very different from Miskatonic Museum. Before I get too far into talking about the actual scenario, I wanted to mention that there is a story in the Investigators of Arkham Horror book that's also set in the Arkham Historical Society. That's the story for Mandy Thompson, the researcher. That story doesn't tie into the Carcosa narrative at all, but it does utilize this same setting, and it also sets up some elements that are used in the scenario. There's even a quote from the story that's used here as flavor text. It's not essential reading at all, but if you have access to the Investigator's book, you might find it to be an interesting companion piece to Echoes of the Past. More importantly, though, I really recommend that you check out the short story The Yellow Sign from Chambers' original King in Yellow collection. It's public domain, you can read it on Wikimedia, and I think that knowing that one story is going to enhance your enjoyment of Echoes a little bit. So most Arkham scenarios feature some kind of unique hook or new twist on the core gameplay, and Echoes of the Past is no exception. What Echoes does to set itself apart is it shakes up the flow of the agenda deck by approaching Doom in a unique way. While I think the twist is interesting, it does bring issues with it. The problem is it just ends up deflating a lot of the tension from the scenario, and on top of that, it's an easy scenario to begin with in terms of what it asks you to do. So the result is that at times you just don't feel much challenge or pressure when you're playing Echoes. That's not every play, and I think at higher player counts it may function better, but more often than not the scenario ends up being a cakewalk. That's how it was when a friend and I played it for the first time. It definitely felt like was that it type moment when we hit the end of the scenario. One other time I did a one-handed solo play where I felt like I basically failed to deal with any of the cards that I drew from the encounter deck. I just sort of ignored them, and I still managed to go on and win this scenario. It's not every play that's like this. I have had plays that did feel more tense, but those plays seem to be in the minority. Now, I don't think that being easy is necessarily a terrible thing for a scenario. Back when Miskatonic Museum came out, my initial impression of it was that it was somewhat easy, but I don't feel like that ultimately detracted very much from my enjoyment of Miskatonic Museum. In fact, I've come to really appreciate that scenario, but I think that it did things that helped it maintain its tension in spite of its low overall difficulty. It had some treachery cards that you really sometimes dreaded drawing. More important than that, though, it had stretch goals built into it in the form of locations that could be cleared for victory points beyond what you needed to do to just complete the scenario. I think Echoes would have really benefited from having something like that, some way to push your luck for additional experience or some extra campaign bonuses. You can bring your own homework, like solving your strange solution or playing your Delve 2 Deeps, but I would have liked to have seen something baked into the scenario. Outside of the gameplay, I was also a little disappointed in the story text in Echoes. For one thing, I found the situation depicted in this scenario to be a little generic, especially coming off some really weird and interesting scenario stories in the Deluxe box. More importantly, though, one of the things I really liked about that Deluxe box content was that it felt like the Carcosa campaign had a unique voice to it, one that was different from Dunwich and from the core. And for the most part, I feel like that didn't continue in Echoes, unfortunately. It feels like it reverted back to Arkham's default tone, without the madness and the paranoia that I really enjoyed from the Deluxe box. I really hope that gets back on track, especially with the next scenario going to Arkham Asylum. Now, on the positive side, one thing I thought Echoes handled really well was the Carcosa campaign elements. I thought it did a good job of utilizing the previous campaign events and generating some new ones. I especially liked how the impacts of some of the events from the previous scenario, The Last King, started to come into focus with Echoes. I enjoyed The Last King already, but I think I like it even better post-Echoes, and I know with each Mythos pack that scenario is going to continue to get more interesting, just as a consequence of understanding what its different threads mean for your campaign. So I'm still really looking forward to watching the Carcosa cycle unfold, and with Echoes out, I'm even more optimistic that it's going to be a great campaign. So to wrap up, I do think that Echoes is a weaker scenario. I would say it's probably even my least favorite expansion scenario to have come along so far. It's not terrible or unfun, but to me it does feel like a step down from the high marks that were set by the excellent stuff in the Carcosa Deluxe box. As I said though, I still find myself very optimistic and enthusiastic about the rest of the Carcosa campaign. I like the direction the campaign is going with the Deluxe box events, and I'm also really interested to see what later events are going to stem from the choices made in Echoes of the Past. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Echoes of the Past. I will be back at some point to do a more detailed scenario review for this pack with spoilers, but that'll be later on down the road. As always, thanks for watching the Atlas Agency, and good luck in your own investigations of the Carcosa cycle.